Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Gary. How are you?
I'm fine. I think you're muted.
Not on here. Can you
Oh,
hear
wait a
me
minute. Nope,
here?
nope, you're fine. I had my speakers turned off.
Oh, I had mine
Uh,
turned down today, so that's what I wanted to check.
No, I had mine turned off because well, what I had done was I was listening to some music and I muted the music and then went away. And when I
Uh-huh.
came back, the speakers were still off. So,
Oh, yeah.
so there we go.
Oh, there's Sandy.
Yay. Yep. Oop, she's in the dark. There
Yes.
she is.
Hi, Sandy.
You're muted, Sandy, just so you know.
Oh, thank you.
There
I'm
you are.
just gonna see if Tom can turn on some lights. Can you go to the kitchen and turn on some lights?
There you
There
go.
you go.
Is that better? Am I less in the dark?
Yes.
Yep. Oh, everybody's here.
Yep. Hi, Jenna.
Hi, Marilyn. How are you?
Hi.
Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Jenna. I can't say I'm on my phone. Let's see.
Hey, Moses.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good
Good evening,
evening.
Mosum.
There we go. Showing the snow here.
Yes.
So,
Again.
I mean, this was from 3 years ago, but it might as well have been yesterday.
Yes.
I know.
So anyway, well, good to see y'all. We'll just go ahead and get going since everybody's here.
Alrighty.
Okay.
The last evening, so. There we go. And depending on how quickly we go, there should be plenty of time for any sort of closing questions. So tonight we'll talk primarily about how the Episcopal Church is organized and governed, and then what we are all about in terms of mission. And if you haven't seen the recording of the session with Larry Hitt and Bishop Epting and Jim Wolfe, if you haven't seen that, go ahead and watch it. I mean, that will fill in a lot of stuff that I probably won't touch on, or you can say, oh, when they said such and so, that was really, okay. So anyway, so that's what we're going to do tonight. Just see if there are any questions. And then a reminder, I always find it helpful, just remind people of where we've been. We spent, certainly the history, worship and prayer, Bible. And then last week we were talking about, the way we think as Episcopalians or Anglicans. And so that's where we've been. And like I said, tonight where we're going is basically how the church is organized and run and all of that kind of stuff. So where I want to start is here. Everything stems from worship, and that has been kind of the case for a lot of what we've talked about, at least after the history session, is that there's just been a lot of focus on what our worship says, what it does, where it's related to scripture, all of those kinds of things. But in this case, what I would say is everything stems from worship. In other words, who stands where and why. And it's not so apparent at Good Shepherd, but there are other churches where it's very apparent in terms of who is standing where and what that means and things like that. So right now, we have what are known as the biblical orders, order of ministry, of ordained ministry. bishop, priest, and the deacon. And of course, the gentleman in the sort of center, in the kind of mustard colored robes and the funny hat, is a bishop. And you can tell that by the cope, not by the cope, but by the mitre, the hat, which no other order wears that. I can wear a cope, it's just a cloak, and I do sometimes, but only the bishop will wear the hat, and he's carrying what's called a crozier, a staff. It almost always has a hook, so it's supposed to look like a shepherd's hook. So he's the chief shepherd. So there's symbol, and sometimes it's very ornate. The one that he has is sort of somewhere in the middle. Sometimes it's just simple wood. It will be interesting to see what Bishop Kim brings with her. Sometimes, I remember Bishop Rob, her predecessor, had a traveling crozier that could be screwed together, break down and put into a carrying case, and left the real formal crozier just sitting in one of the rooms at Grace Cathedral, or at St. John's Cathedral, where he'd really sort of use it, but it didn't break down, and so it was hard to get in the car, those kinds of things. So there's these practical concerns, right? The two women on the right are priests, and you can tell that because of the way they're wearing their stole. Priests will wear the stole around the neck, draped down in front. Sometimes, and in some parts of the church, they'll wear it crossed, so it'll sort of make an X across their chest. You don't see that very much anymore. That was kind of old school, and it's kind of gone out of fashion. I'm always surprised now when I see it, but most priests will just wear it as these two women will. And then the gentleman on the left is a deacon, and you can tell that because it goes across his chest. And when you see Deacon Nadine, that's how she's wearing hers, and I'm wearing mine around my neck. When a bishop, you can almost see it on the bishop. Under his right hand, the lower of the two hands, you can see a stole coming down on his right side. Bishops also wear their stoles draped like priests. So you can't tell he's a bishop just by his stole. You tell it by the hat and by the stick. So these biblical orders are distinct, but they overlap with the various ministries that the different clergy exercise. But then, of course, we're all ordained by virtue of being baptized. So we're all ministers. It's just that the ordained clergy have been called to special ministry within the church. And each one of them have particular ministries. And Weber in this book on page 100, and I'm just going to read this because I think it's really helpful. He writes, although it's been traditional to speak of 3 orders of ordained ministry, it's now sometimes suggested that baptism is in reality the ordination of lay people. The ministry of the bishop in succession to the apostles is described as that of chief, priest, and pastor. When Christians gather for worship and a bishop is present, it is the bishop who presides, and it is the bishop who ordains others to carry on the ministry in local communities. Now, we have 2 retired bishops that frequently attend at Good Shepherd, but because they're retired, they are no longer the chief pastor. They're just retired clergy that sit in the congregation, but they can still, once you're ordained for life. Once you're baptized for life. I am a priest for life unless I renounce my orders, and there's a ceremony to take care of that. So priests are those who serve primarily in parishes, presiding at the Eucharist, baptizing, teaching, preaching, and supporting the lay people on a daily basis. So when Bishop Kim comes, I will basically, in many respects, I was telling somebody the other day, I'll just be window dressing. because I really won't have much to do. Nadine as a deacon will still have something to do. The deacon, the role of the deacon of reading the gospel and setting the table, I might help set the table. But for the most part, I'll just sort of sit up there and help out, which is kind of cool. But that's because the chief pastor is there. When I had my celebration of new ministry, she backed out and let me celebrate, but that was her choice. That wasn't I did not ask for that. And then the ministry of deacons, like that of lay people, has been neglected. The author writes, but the deacon has a designated role in the liturgy. Like I said, that's reading the gospel, and in some churches, it's leading the prayers of the people. We don't do that because we hadn't had a deacon and we needed somebody else to do it. Most churches that I've been in, it's lay folks who do that. But so the deacon has a role in the liturgy, but his more important role is a servant of those in need, providing a model of servant ministry for all Christians, bringing the compassion of Christ into the lives of those in need. It has been said that the deacons represent the church to the world, and they interpret the world to the church, that there's sort of a go-between role for the deacon. And Nadine is very good at that. She's been very active in homeless ministries and things like that. So it's a very good description. So those are the three what are called biblical orders. Now, where did that come from? So in the New Testament, we can trace this development. And certainly when Jesus was alive and wandering around teaching and healing, there were priests and rabbis and Levites. The priests were the ones that offered the sacrifices in the temples. Oops, sorry about that. I just lost my video. You didn't want to see me anyway. Come on. There we go. Come on. My video keeps cycling off. Let me try one more time, and if that doesn't resolve.
There you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so the priests were the ones that functioned in the temple. They were the ones that performed the sacrifices. There were still Levites, and they were they sang. They helped out. They were the functionaries around the temple. And then the rabbis were teachers in the synagogues. They were leaders of synagogues. They may have come from priestly families, but maybe not. So we see in the New Testament, we see kind of three orders. Scribes were lawyers. They were just experts in the law. Well, Jesus gathers around himself lots of disciples. There were a lot of them, but he chose 12, special 12, probably the 12 to coincide or to represent the 12 tribes. But Jesus chose 12 and called them apostles. Sometimes it's hard when you're reading the Gospels to tease out who he's talking to, because he'll say, he drew his disciples to him and he said to them, well, is it the 12 or is it all of his disciples, which included Mary Magdalene and all of these other people? They were following him around too, and were considered disciples, but not necessarily apostles. Then in the book of Acts, which at least when it was written, was certainly later than the period that it is talking about, there is this story of the apostles doling out money to the widows of the congregation. And the non-Jewish, the non-Hebrew or non-Israelite Jews, or the converts from the Gentile world, were complaining that their widows weren't getting their fair share. And so Peter says, it's not right for us to neglect the work that we're supposed to do just to wait on tables. And so they selected 7 deacons and that was the word, servants, diakonia, and they selected 7 and ordained them, and that story is in Acts 6. One of them was Stephen, who became actually the first martyr of the church. So here we've got deacons early on in the church. There's a story, there's some stories about a guy named Philip who was an evangelist. That seemed to be some kind of title, but we're not really sure. But he was given a particular job to be an evangelist. And then Paul, in his letters, talks about various ministries in the church, what are called charismatic ministries, or ministries that you have the gift to do. And so there are those who are called prophets. They have a gift of prophecy, gift of teaching, gift of healing. And these looked like they were orders, that they were particular roles that people filled within the church in the early churches. But we don't see them carried on in quite the same way over the course of history as we saw what we're going to hear a little bit more about in just a second about bishops, priests, and deacons. Well, later on in Acts, we read that there were elders appointed in the churches. So Paul is doing his evangelism thing, his missionary work, and he's founding churches, but he can't be in all of them. So he needs to have somebody lead the congregation in his absence. And so he appoints elders. And, that may mean that they were the oldest one. It may mean it was their house that the church was meeting in. It may mean that they just had wisdom beyond their years or spiritual maturity beyond their years. So Paul appointed these elders. The word there is presbyter in Greek, and that's the word that we get for priest. And it's also the word elder is the word that's given in used in Presbyterian churches to define the chief pastor, but it's Presbyterian, right? It's the church that is sort of organized around pastors, and so we see that in Acts 14. Then in Philippians, another letter by Paul, that's in the first verse of Philippians, Paul to the elders of the church in Philippi. And so, or to the overseers, the Episcopal, and that's the word for bishops. That's where we get our word. So they were overseeing the church or the churches in Philippi. So now we've got presbyters and Episcopoi and deacons all mentioned as we go through sort of the historical development of the New Testament. But it's not until we get to 1 Timothy and the book of Titus, these are considered pastoral epistles, because they really have to do with how you're running a church. and they're later. Most scholars think that they're much later than most of the other letters, sometime toward the end of the first century. Most scholars don't think that Paul wrote them because of language and because of the situations that are apparent in those churches. And so here, they're finally, those 3 orders, bishops, priests, and deacons, are mentioned kind of at the same time in the same letter. And so you begin to get the picture that at this point, 60 years after Jesus has died and the church has grown, that there are structures of leadership in the church. So all of this goes back to the first or the very early part of the 2nd century. So that's how that sort of developed through the New Testament. Well, after that, then it gets complicated, and the church develops a lot more orders, and so what's bigger than a bishop? Well, an archbishop is bigger than a bishop. What's bigger than an archbishop? A primate, the head of a huge body of churches, like the Pope or the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church or something like that. This guy in the red hat's a cardinal. I'm not sure what the white hat is, maybe just a plain bishop, or what the other guy is wearing. But the red hat is a cardinal. So the orders get ramped up the scale a little bit, but then they also sort of, I don't want to say ramp down, but there are these ways of moving up the hierarchy, if you want to call it that. And so it starts, if you want to be, sort of move up the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In the old days, you started as the doorkeeper, that guy on the far left. Then you might move up and be a lector, a reader, and then an exorcist. We don't have many of those around. And then an acolyte, and then a subdeacon, and then you see the three orders that we've been talking about. And in some churches that really follow kind of an older style of worship, you would have a priest at a regular Sunday service. You would have a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon, and they would be dressed a little bit differently. The deacon and the subdeacon would be dressed a little bit differently, and they would stand on different stairs going up towards the altar. So you could really see who stood where and what their role was in the church. These orders that are sort of listed in blue, we don't see those as stepping stones to ordination anymore. Certainly a lot of people who seek ordination have been most of these things, except an exorcist. Exorcism, we have a book in the Episcopal Church called the Book of Occasional Offices. And there is a rite in there. Exorcism is listed in there, but there's not anything that tells you how to do it. It basically says, if this is something you want to do, you better talk to the bishop. Not something that anybody is sort of, able to trot off and do. But there was this order, of the order of orders of moving up towards ordination. So this is how things sort of developed from no order in the church except the apostles, and then maybe some elders and some deacons, and then it moved to the rather elaborate schema, and now it's really returned to bishops, priests, and deacons with a greater appreciation for the ministry of the laity than we had in the past, or at least until the 1979 prayer book. So does that all make sense? Any questions on that?
So bishops are the highest order in the Episcopal Church?
A bishop?
Yeah,
Was
yes.
that-
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are no cardinals in the Episcopal Church.
We don't
right?
know. No, we don't have that. So the book pointed out that we have a presiding bishop, and until a certain point in time, the presiding bishop, just sort of presided over gatherings of the bishops. And usually it was the senior bishop, and that was, of a diocese. He was bishop of a diocese, but he was the senior bishop in the succession in the church. And then the church got too complex to govern, run, whatever. So now the presiding bishop is elected. We're getting ready to elect a new presiding bishop. Is elected, and whoever that bishop is will have to resign his or her role as the bishop of a diocese to become the presiding bishop. But the presiding bishop really only speaks for the church, not necessarily, and to the church, but does not have any kind of legislative or authority, not in the same way that a pope would have authority. That in the Diocese of Colorado, the presiding bishop has no more authority than Bishop Kim. It's just that he is the leader of the national church. Now, other national churches, their leader might be an archbishop, and how their national church might function might give that archbishop more power than other bishops. But I thought that the author was really good in saying actually Methodist bishops have more power in terms of governing than Episcopal bishops, because Methodist bishops can assign clergy to congregations, and Episcopal clergy or Episcopal bishops don't do that. So there isn't really anything higher than a bishop in the Episcopal Church. There are functional
just
roles.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Sandy.
No, I was just, yeah, because I asked Tom that because our presiding bishops over the nation, right? And then
Mhm.
Bishop Kim is just for Colorado. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Just want to
Yeah,
make sure. Because
Yeah.
I work for the Methodist, so I know
Right,
we're
right.
different.
Yeah. Yeah, and while it's not necessary, the presiding bishop is usually there when a new bishop is consecrated. So Weber, the author, said that in the Episcopal Church, actually this goes back quite a ways, you have to have 3 bishops to make another bishop, to make sure that the whole church is represented, at least symbolically, by those 3. And usually the presiding bishop is there. Sometimes that doesn't work because of scheduling and things like that. And then there will be somebody that will sort of stand in, another bishop will stand in the role of presiding bishop, in role of presiding at the ceremony. But usually the presiding bishop's there, but he or she, we've had a female presiding bishop. They don't have any special power that they are conferring on the bishop. If you ever see the ordination of a bishop in the Episcopal Church, what will happen is that all of the bishops that are there have to be at least 3, but there are usually, I don't know, 8 or 9 or maybe 10, depending on schedules. They'll come because the new bishop is a friend or something like that. They'll all stand there and lay their hands on the bishop that's being ordained. It is, I have to say, I've been probably at 4 or 5 bishop consecrations. It's a very solemn and moving moment. And it's really, really, really quite profound. So, but that was a long answer to your question, Moses. Sorry about that.
So is there a fixed number of bishops or does that fluctuate?
Well, once you're ordained a bishop, you're a bishop for life. Unless you get deposed or you renounce your orders. So the short answer is no, it just depends on who's alive. But each diocese will have a diocesan bishop. So I forget how many dioceses we have in the United States. Let's say there are 98. So we have 98 diocesan bishops. Sometimes the diocese is large and one bishop can't cover all of the congregations. So they may hire an assistant, which might be a retired bishop from another diocese, just to help out with confirmations and stuff like that. They may ask for a bishop that's called a suffragan, which is somebody who really just helps out. He or she is not the diocesan bishop, doesn't have all the authority that the diocesan bishop does, but has authority to help ordain, to confirm, and all of those kinds of things. And then there's one other kind of bishop called a bishop coadjutor, and that's what some dioceses will call in a bishop coadjutor. They'll elect that person, and that person will be an understudy to the diocesan bishop until the diocesan bishop retires. And then they just assume the new role. And that makes, for some people, that makes a more seamless transition than what we might have seen in Colorado when Bishop Rob announced his retirement. We started a search for a new bishop. Rob served as bishop until Bishop Kim was consecrated, and then Rob went up, and then Rob left. So the transition happened in the cathedral. When Kim became the diocesan bishop, Rob left. So there wasn't any sort of overlap like there would be if there was a coadjutor. So some dioceses do it that way, some don't. So it really depends on how an individual diocese wants to operate as to whether or not it needs other bishops officially, like a suffragan or an assistant bishop. We don't have them, we had a suffragan bishop for a while because this is a big state. And with all of the churches out on the western slope, we had a suffragan bishop who basically lived like in Grand Junction and worked with a lot of those churches out on the western slope, just so that they had more regular communication. We haven't had that certainly since I've been here, but it's an expensive proposition to pay another bishop. They ain't cheap. So we don't have that. I do know that Bishop Kim has relied on a number of retired bishops that still live in Colorado to help her out. When she had COVID, Bishop Epting stepped in at Good Shepherd and did the confirmations at Good Shepherd because, she let me know at 9 o'clock Saturday night that she wasn't going to be there on Sunday morning. And I quickly sent out an email. And then there were a couple of regional confirmations that she couldn't go to because of illness. And so Bishop Epting has helped out there, but he's not on the payroll. He just helps out. Okay.
How are candidates for bishops selected?
Well, the diocese will develop a profile of what the diocese is like and what it's looking for. And then they will publish that profile, and people will nominate folks to say, hey, you should look at this and throw your hat in the ring. And so there will be, people will apply for the job. There's a search committee on behalf of the entire diocese. It's made up of clergy and laity, and they will go through all of the applications and whittle them down to a number that then they will conduct some interviews and maybe go see them in their congregation and see how they function. And then they'll whittle that down a little bit more to maybe 4 or 5 or 3. And they will invite those people. They will then publicize the names of all of the folks that of those that are officially going to be up for election. And then those people will come to, they came to Colorado and sort of did a walkabout. They went around the diocese where 4 or 5 different places where folks were able to come and enter into conversation with them. So they got to know them a little bit more, ask them some questions, and answer questions, what do you think is important in Grand Junction, or, for example. And then shortly thereafter, there will be an election. And the delegates and clergy of the diocese will gather for that election. And the successful candidate has to receive a majority of votes from both the clergy and the laity. It's not a simple majority. Both houses, the house of the clergy and the house of the delegates, have to agree. And so after the first couple of votes, sometimes you can see which way the wind is blowing. Other times, I've been in dioceses where there's been a lot of politicking going on between votes. So that's how it happens. It's a very democratic process, or you can say it's a process that allows the Holy Spirit to work. Okay, let's move on. So we've kind of seen how all of this has worked, but now now in this sort of modern world, this very, very global world, how does this all play out? How does Good Shepherd in the Diocese of California, as a member of the Episcopal Church in the United States, how does it relate to all of these other groups that trace their history back to Canterbury? So this picture, I think, I don't know if this is from the Lambeth. This is the Lambeth Conference of Bishops. That look like Justin Welby, and I don't know how old this is. This is not the last one. This may have been 1998. But you can see all of these bishops from all over the world. You see all of the non-white faces. And in that, and these are the leaders of all of the dioceses, that sent them. So you see this very non-European looking crowd. And that is a representation of what the Anglican communion looks like. So when I say Anglican communion, what do I mean? And already meant that is the seal of the Anglican communion. And what that means is that your particular body, so the Episcopal Church in the United States, is in full communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's what being in communion means, is that we can share clergy, we can easily go back and forth in terms of taking communion and stuff like that. We agree on most things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the Anglican communion are those churches around the world that are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And you can figure out who those are if you can get a list of the people who are invited to Lambeth. So the bishops who are invited to Lambeth are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, because that Archbishop is the one that issues the invitations. Now, and we just had our last Lambeth, 6 months ago. And if you were able to hear the conversation that Bishop Epting and Larry Hitt and Jim Wolfe had, you will have heard more about that than I would be able to tell you this evening. But there are churches and large groups of Anglicans, people who trace their history back to the to Canterbury, but who are no longer in communion with either the Episcopal Church or with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And most of those have developed in the last 50 years. And over several issues. So when the Episcopal Church back in the late 70s developed a new prayer book, we moved away from the prayer book that the church had been using since 1928 and developed a new prayer book. There were a lot of very traditional Anglicans who said, no, you can't do that. And so they started their own congregation, their own sort of denomination, and over the issues of the prayer book. And one of those is called the Anglican Church in America. That's what ACA stands for. There are approximately 5,000 of those in the United States. So it's a really small group. But they don't use the prayer book that we have. They still use the prayer book that is now almost 100 years old. All traditional language, a slightly different theological bent, for example, in terms of ordination and things like that. Similar to that, arising about the same time, but not necessarily because of the prayer book, but because we decided we were going to ordain women. Another body developed, the Anglican Catholic Church. And it has about 35,000 members. And this is in America, 35,000. And there is an Anglican Catholic Church in Denver. And it's on Iliff, about 3 or 4 blocks east of University Avenue, and it's St. Mary's Anglican Catholic Church. So it's there. I used to go by it almost every day when I would go to work at DU. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Then there's another body that I don't have listed on the slide that's called the Anglican Church of North America. Well, the Anglican Catholic Church will not ordain women. The Anglican Church of North America is yet another sort of splinter group that has emerged more recently than 1979. And it has about 120,000 members in the United States. So it's significantly larger than either of the other two. And it depends on individual dioceses whether they will have women or not. So it's kind of up in the air for them. They have written their own new prayer book. But it's a local choice. They tend to be evangelical or charismatic. And we have one of these in Denver, at least one. And it's actually right down the street from where I live. It's called Resurrection Anglican Fellowship. And it's on Bellevue between Yosemite and Dayton. And it's just, I go by it almost every day. But it's, again, and some of these groups have aligned themselves with larger churches in Africa, primarily, where they've been getting some kind of support. There was another group called the Anglican Mission in America, AMIA. Sometimes we'll still hear about it, but these were it was an organization. I'm not quite sure to call it a denomination, that basically churches in Africa were sending missionaries to the United States. They were convinced that the Episcopal Church had gone off its rails, and they needed to send in missionaries. And so that was the Anglican Mission in America. And it still may be going. I don't hear much about it anymore. What we do hear now a lot more about is the last little bullet point on there called GAFCON, which stands for the Global Anglican Futures Conference. And it's made up of Anglicans all over the world. But again, some of them are national and some of them are more local, but most of them have said they think that the first world Anglican churches, so Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, have gotten far too liberal. And these folks sort of represent a larger group, some of whom are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's not its own denomination, it's a conference. So it's complex, and it's gotten complex in the last 50, 60 years as the Episcopal Church wrote a new prayer book, began to ordain women. Other churches began to ordain women. The Episcopal Church began to ordain lesbian and gay people. Some of the other Anglican bodies have begun to do that. GAFCON, mostly in the global South, much more conservative, has sort of pushed back on that. So that's kind of the state of the Anglican Communion right now, or at least the historic Anglican Communion. So here is Anglican church membership worldwide. And I think that this map dates back maybe 15 years ago. So you can see the populations of these various churches. So in the United States, it says 2.3. I don't think it's quite that high anymore. I think the number now is about 1.9 million. I'm not sure what the numbers are in any of the other countries, but and of course, when you look at the United Kingdom with 13.4 million, technically you're kind of born into the church in Britain. So that's kind of a fuzzy number. But if you look at Nigeria, 17.5 million Anglicans in Nigeria, 8 million in Uganda, 5 million in Sudan, more in Kenya than there are in the United States, probably more in Tanzania than there are in the United States. So when you go back to that picture of all of these bishops at a Lambeth conference, and you see all of these non-European faces, well, that's where they're coming from, is that they're coming from the Southern Cone. And then there are certainly some in India as well as in the Far East, but the numbers are not quite as large.
Is that a
So this
result?
is.
I'm sorry.
Pardon? Oh.
Are the African Episcopal churches, are they a result of missions work by European?
Yes,
the
yeah, primarily.
Anglican churches?
Primarily, if you look at most of these countries, they were most of those were colonized by the British. The British West Indies, of course, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, whether it's the Brits or the Dutch. So yes, almost all of the Anglican Communion are those churches around the world are the result of colonization. Now, there are certainly there are Episcopal churches and Anglican churches in Europe. But as you see, there are only communities with at least 500,000 members. But what those churches usually are places like in Paris or Rome or some of these large cities where expats, or folks who are working in those cities can find an Episcopal church in Paris. So they're still able to worship with other American Episcopalians. They're just doing it in Paris. So it's represented in a lot of other places, but most of these national churches were, yes, the product of colonialism, as was, of course, the church in America. Good question. So in the US, we've broken the Episcopal Church up into regional provinces. And the author points out that these are obviously geographic, but they allow for ministry among in the region that might be a regional emphasis. So, for example, what is of concern to those 5 or 6 states up in Province 1, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, they've got different issues that they have to deal with than, let's say, Province 8, that all of the West, right? Questions in Province 4 down in the Southeast, the traditional, kind of the Confederate states, right? That's Province 4. Their realities of race and racial issues very different than the realities in Province 8, where race is mostly, I won't say entirely, a lot of it is spelled out in terms of a Hispanic population as well as an Asian population. Neither of those are quite so large in Province 4 or even in Province 6, where we are. So sometimes, and I was the coordinator for ministry and higher education for 3 or 4 years in Province 8. So I traveled to almost all of those dioceses in Province 8, except for Hawaii. Except for Alaska. I even made it to Hawaii to talk with all of these ministers, all of these campus ministers, and how we could coordinate and bring our students together. There were various other, the Episcopal church women in that province were able to get together and talk about ministry. So we're in Province 6, along with Minnesota and, the Dakotas. We have a provincial meeting. There are coordinators for various kinds of ministries within the province. They meet. There's a provincial budget that usually comes out of the national church to help provinces engage in ministry as they see it. So we are in Province 6. I was in Province 8. I was ordained in Province 4. So I know a lot of folks in a lot of different parts of the country. And is it an effective way? I don't know. But it seems to work. And a lot of people don't know about the provinces, but we're affected by some of the decisions they make. So you see that there is, Haiti and the Virgin Islands, they're part of the Episcopal Church. They're not some other, but they are part of the Episcopal Church of America and the United States of America. And the Episcopal Church has decided that all of our publications need to be published in 3 languages. So we have a prayer book in English, we have a prayer book in Spanish, and we have a prayer book in French for the Haitians. We don't have one in Chinese, not an official one. But there has been one that has been written. It was written privately by a Chinese priest in San Francisco. And then you see this group of American churches in Europe, Belgium, France, Germany, Wiesbaden, Switzerland, Italy. So there are these churches in Europe that are also part of the Episcopal Church. So we're spread, but mostly we're located here. And you then down in the bottom, you see Province 9, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Honduras. These are part of, at least some of them, I think, are still part of the Episcopal Church, because they hadn't formed their own diocese or their own province. There might be a new province. I can't remember. This map is just a little bit old. So that's how the Episcopal Church is divided up within the United States. So I thought that, again, go back and watch that video if you haven't. General Convention is what governs the church. It's our legislative body, theoretically meeting every 3 years. And it's made up of representatives from all of the dioceses. All of the bishops form the House of Bishops. And then the House of Deputies is a mixture of lay and clergy from each diocese. So 4 lay people and 4 clergy from each diocese, and then form the House of Deputies, and then there's the House of Bishops. And if there's going to be legislation, they have to agree. And it has to be exact agreement down to the punctuation. That was one of the things that Larry pointed out several times. So the General Convention decides on a new prayer book. General Convention, or the deputies and the bishops, are the ones who will vote for a new presiding bishop. If there is somebody who is going to be added to our calendar of saints, it's General Convention that votes on that. So this is that legislative body that really does run the church. But it only meets every 3 years in normal times, right? And in between times, the church has to run. And so there's this group called Executive Council that really runs the church while, along with the presiding bishop, between conventions. And so in the Diocese of California, we have a standing committee, along with the bishop, run the church between diocesan conventions, right? And our vestry, that we will elect in a week and a half, or next Sunday, they run the church, between annual meetings. If there are decisions to be made, that's the body that makes them. So what we do at the local level is mirrored at the diocesan level, and then at the national level. And then there are other groups within the church that do the business of the church between conventions. There is a committee that works on the prayer book. There are committees that work on how we should do missions. All of these kinds of things. Then they will report to General Convention, or General Convention will tell them what to do before the next one. We want you to do the research and write up what this next thing will be. So there are these groups that operate between conventions, but it's really the General Convention that makes all of the decisions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So here's the organization of General Convention.
Goodness.
Yeah, so you've got Executive Council over there on the right, and you've got over on the left, you see parishes send people to diocesan conventions. They send people to general conventions and to the provinces. So you can see it. It's pretty complex. You can go blind looking at this. But General Convention, the Episcopal Church, is a corporation, in terms of American law, and so it has to have operating officer and finance officer and legal officer, and all of these people that any corporation needs to have. And Good Shepherd is a corporation. I am the president of the corporation. Our senior warden is the vice president. We have a secretary of the corporation, and we have a treasurer of the corporation. All of these will be elected next week. So the general convention does that as well. So you can see that how elections happen and all of that. But I don't want to spend any more time on that. I'd rather have conversation, but it's, like I say, it's pretty detailed and complex.
Jim Wolf is the senior warden for our church. Is that right?
Yeah, Jim Wolf is the senior warden for Good Shepherd. Yes. So in the Diocese of Colorado, our bishop is Kim Lucas. This is a photo of her receiving the call saying that she'd been elected. So I guess her husband was standing there with camera in hand. And she got this call at her home in Virginia and or Washington, D.C. And that was the picture of her getting the call. So that's who will be here. If you have not met her or seen her before, that's who will be here in a week and a half. So Colorado, sorry for the resolution on this map. I couldn't find a really good one. We're divided up into regions in the state. So kind of like the provinces in the national church, Colorado and other dioceses divide the state up, or the diocese up, into regions for purposes of common ministry. The folks down in southeastern Colorado, the Sangre de Cristo region, they have concerns that are very different than the people up in the Northwest region. You know, their concerns down in Sangre de Cristo are agriculture and in ways where the Northwest region has a lot of resorts, you know, and so their concerns are a little bit different. And so they function for common ministry to help fund common ministries, and also for collegiality among the clergy. The diocese, the clergy of the diocese get together once a year for a conference, and it happens in May. And so we get together to meet and talk and for continuing education. And then, of course, the whole diocese meets once a year at convention. But, you know, for some folks, they, especially, you know, in the South, in some of those larger regions, they hardly ever get to see other clergy because they're way out somewhere. And so the regions provide an opportunity for folks to get together. We are in the High Plains region, that big pinky purple thing in the upper right-hand corner. And so our region technically extends clear out to Sterling and Fort Morgan. We don't see those folks very often. The churches way out there are pretty small. But we try and maintain contact with them. Our region gets together, at least the clergy get together about once every couple months. Our next meeting is this coming Thursday, but I have now 2 funerals on Thursday, so I won't be going to that meeting. It's funny that the Front Range region, the sort of bluish one right in the upper center, we've got folks that are just on the other side of the Platte River from us, in Littleton, and they're in the Front Range region, not in High Plains. And their nearest congregation from the church that's in Littleton is way up in Lakewood, and we're closer to them physically, you know, but we're separated by that thing called the Platte River. So I don't want to say it's arbitrary. You got to make some decisions, but sometimes it's county by county. But this is the way that our church, our diocese, is divided up. And each one of those regions, there is a person who is tasked to sort of do all of the coordinating to draw the meeting, to draw people together for meetings and things like that. In some places it's a lay person, most times it's a clergy person. This just gets added on top of their regular job, and they get paid a little bit extra money for that. Sometimes get this question: what's the difference between a parish and a mission? The book did a relatively good job of this. The picture is of the mission, San Carlos Borromeo. It's the mission in Carmel, California. I just thought, it's a mission. It's a nice place, but has nothing to do with Colorado. But I like the picture.
I've been
so,
there.
Yeah,
I've been
well,
to that mission. Yeah.
I have sung in that mission as a part of a couple of choirs. It's really kind of fun. So a mission is a congregation that is planted or started either by the diocese. Sometimes the diocese will say, this area of town is growing like topsy. It needs a church. And so the diocese will hire a clergy person to go out and start a church in, a growing area of town. There are arguments. We don't have a church in Highlands Ranch. And there are people who would say that it was really short-sighted on the side, on the part of the diocese, not to put a church in, to plant a church in Highlands Ranch. Now that Sterling Ranch down there by Chatfield Reservoir is growing like crazy, there are arguments to do something down there. Although we do have a church in Sedalia, it's teeny, so the diocese may decide to plant a church. Good Shepherd was a mission planted jointly by the church, but also by St. Timothy's. Members at St. Timothy said, we need a church further east in Centennial because Centennial was growing. And so Good Shepherd grew out of that. And so there are places where a larger congregation will seed and plant another congregation. And they may say, okay, you folks, going to St. Timothy's, you all live over there. Why don't you go and start that congregation over there? Sometimes creates a little bit of tension. People say, no, I don't want to leave. They say, oh yeah, okay, that will be fun. So missions are generally not financially self-supporting. They're funded either by the diocese or by the congregation that sent them. And the person who heads the mission, the clergy person in charge, is known as the vicar, the person who is sort of the deputy of the sending body. So if the mission was started by the diocese, then the vicar has been appointed by the bishop. If it's a congregational one, the vicar would probably be appointed by the congregation. So it's, a priest still has regular control just like a rector does. It's just that the congregation isn't financially self-sufficient. When it reaches the point of self-sufficiency, it will become a parish. And that means that it governs itself. It's raising its own money, so it governs itself. And the clergy person, the priest who heads that up is the rector. So the author, and what I wrote here is that really translates ruler. One person said, no, rector comes from rex. That means king. So, so I'm the king of the congregation. Yeah, right. Yeah. That and $5 will get me a cup of coffee. And so the governing body within the church at Good Shepherd is the vestry. We will elect the vestry, or at least new members to the vestry next week. In a mission, it's usually called the Bishop's Committee, because it usually is smaller than a vestry, because really it's making reports to the bishop. The bishop is still in control of the congregation. It's just a smaller group that's keeping the congregation going. Now, churches can, if for some reason, lose membership or lose money, they can revert to mission status to be kept alive by the diocese. Oh, there we go again. Bumped my, come on. There we go. Got a really touchy connection, I see. If a parish becomes no longer self-sufficient and requires funding from the diocese to stay open, it will revert to mission status.
Mhm.
You may not change clergy or anything like that. It may be, nothing that has much to do with anything. Often what happens is the demographics of the area shift. And so you had a church that was a great parish, and then the demographics of the area change, and there's an exodus and all of a sudden, all those big pledges are no longer there. And it can revert to mission status. Sometimes there might be a church fight and all of the big donors leave and the little ones, the lesser donors stay and they want to keep the church going. Then if they build it back up, it can resume being a full-flown parish. So it can go either way, but it all has to do with financial self-sufficiency.
So, you talked about self-sufficiency and self-governing, but if I understand correctly, the local congregation doesn't own the church building, for example.
No, they're all held in trust for the bishop, for the diocese. It is the Episcopal Church, the technically the corporation of the bishop, or in some places called bishop's soul, owns all of the buildings, and the churches hold them in trust for the bishop. So yeah, it's our building, and we've got to take care of it, but we can't sell it. Only the diocese can sell it. And so what happened a number of years ago was, there were congregations that wanted to leave the Episcopal Church, going back to those arguments that we were talking about from the late 70s, and they wanted to take their building with them. And lots of court battles, including in Colorado. And depending on what state you were in and how the particular laws governing ownership of buildings were written originally, most of those buildings, those congregations had to leave the building. The breakaway congregations had to leave the building. The building stayed with the Episcopal Church because it's not owned by the congregation. You're absolutely right, Moses. But that's created some legal issues.
Can I ask you a question? When we
Sure, of course.
when we burned the mortgage,
Right.
explain why we were paying for, did we pay for the mortgage on that? What went on?
Okay, so the loan that we finally paid off, the mortgage that we finally paid off was old. It had to do with building the chapel, for one thing, adding on to the building, and doing some renovations. So we borrowed that money, on the market, on the open market, so that we could do all of that building.
Okay.
But when if it were ever to happen that Good Shepherd were to theoretically close, the building just goes, and all of those remodelings go back to the bishop, right? So that's how that works.
Thank you.
So what happens if the local congregation defaults on a mortgage? Does it go to the bank?
That's a good question. I don't know. It
Sorry to
may
get so
be-
technical. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a question that's far beyond my pay grade. Sorry. I don't know. I imagine in some respects the diocese would step in because it's the diocese's building. So, but I don't know what that would mean. I've never heard of that. Not saying that it hasn't happened. I've just never heard of it or how it's been resolved. So, moving along here. So we do have other things that control how we run ourselves. So we have, a law or two. We have the Book of Common Prayer, and we have what are known as the constitutions and canons. So in the Book of Common Prayer, there are rules for how we run our worship. And the next time you sit down in the pew, grab a Book of Common Prayer and look through it, look through the pages that have to do with communion, and you'll see a lot of stuff that's in finer print in italics. Those are called rubrics, and they govern how worship basically should run, how a Eucharistic service shall run. And they're broken out into two kinds of rubrics. There are rubrics that are called, a rubric has to do with the color red, because in old big missals that the Catholics would use, the instructions were written in red for what you should do at all of these things. So they're called rubrics. And there are two different kinds. There are the may rubrics and the shall rubrics. And so the may rubric you'll see is a hymn of praise or some other song may be sung here. You don't have to do it. There are other places where it's a shall rubric. Such and such thing shall happen here. And that's one of those things that you have to do. So even in the Book of Common Prayer, there is there are references to rules, these may rubrics and shall rubrics. And then, of course, towards the back, we have this outline of the faith, or would be called in other traditions a catechism, that sort of give this overarching view of how we see ourselves, but also how we define things in the church, how we define bishop, priest, and deacon and layperson, how we define mission, all of those kinds of things. So all of that is contained in the prayer book. So there's sort of governance in the book itself. In a larger environment, we have what are called the Constitution and canons. And this is how we govern the church in the how we govern the Episcopal Church. We have our own laws, our own rules, and how we deal with organization and administration. So here in the canons, it will describe what a rector is in vis-a-vis corporation life in the church. The rector is supposed to have full control of the building. The rector is, all of these kinds of things. It governs organization and administration. It also we've got rules for worship. We have rules for ministry. What qualifications does a person have to meet to become ordained? What level of education? Those kinds of, how old? All of those rules, they're contained in the Constitution and canons. What happens if a bishop, priest, or deacon embezzles money? What kind of discipline does the church have that's different than what the state has, right? So if you embezzle money, you can be prosecuted by the state. But is there a discipline that the church would have in addition? So the church might say, it would go to an ecclesiastical court, and the ecclesiastical court would say, you have been found guilty of XYZ. You are no longer allowed to officiate. That's discipline. That's the kind of thing that an ecclesiastical court. So we have rules for ecclesiastical courts. I am on the diocesan. It's not a board, disciplinary something. I forget what it's called. But if there is an accusation made against a priest or a deacon or something, it comes to that group, and we figure out what to do with it next. I've been on that body for 7 or 8 years, and we've only had 2 instances where that's happened. It doesn't happen very often. It's the kind of committee you want to be on because there's never any work, and you'd never want there to be any work. And then it says rules of order. That's how we run the convention, right? Basically, Robert's Rules of Order with a few little differences. So that's how the church is organized. But what do we do? Well, this is the
Before we
mission of
go
the church.
on.
Yeah.
The canons and rules of order, is it so detailed as to require background checks for people that want to serve in ministry?
Oh yeah. It goes through all of that. It is incredibly detailed. Again, what's the educational, what do you need to do? What kinds of exams do you need to take? It's incredibly detailed. Yep. So the technical title of the Episcopal Church is the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. So this church was founded around mission. And, I thought that the book did a really good job of saying, for a while, these bishops, they were ordained and then sent out to be the bishop of the whole West. They were sent out to be evangelists, not necessarily to sit behind a desk and administer a diocese. So that is our mission. What the prayer book says, our mission is to restore all people to unity with God and with each other. And we have been, for the life of the church, we've been engaged in that mission. It just changed over time. For a long time, churches ran schools. We still do some. Churches ran hospitals. We still do some. But those were big things that the church would do in terms of extension of mission, not only in foreign countries where we still go and build schools and establish hospitals, but also in the US. Big hospital downtown, Presbyterian St. Luke's. I was just there today. St. Luke's Hospital was an Episcopal hospital. It was the Episcopal Church's hospital, and we sold it. It just was bigger than the Episcopal Church was going to handle, and so we just sold it. But so that was, we had that mission. We have 2 Episcopal schools in Denver, St. Anne's, which is on University Avenue, south of DU, and St. Elizabeth's, which is up sort of a Cap Hill neighborhood. St. Elizabeth's really sort of tries to service sort of lower income kids. St. Anne's is sort of more of a traditional Episcopal school. Mary Need, who's a member of our congregation, was the chaplain at St. Anne's. So we've done this, we've engaged in those kinds of missions. We certainly established congregations in throughout the country. We engage in mission work, whether it's working with homeless, immigrants, migrants, all of those kinds of things. That's part of the mission of the Episcopal Church, some of it officially, some of it done by a diocese, some of it individual churches in partnership with others. But we see all of these various things as mission. So that's always a good question to ask, is what does mission mean in 2023 and beyond? And so I've tried to stress at Good Shepherd that our mission is embedded in our baptismal covenant. That thing that we say over and over again, at least 4 times a year, 4 or 5, maybe 6 times a year at Good Shepherd. When we renew our own baptismal vows, will you proclaim by word and example the good news? This is evangelism, pure and simple. Episcopalians don't do it very well, but we're called to do that as much as we're called to do everything else. And I think we need to pick it up. Again, it's not something that we do very well, and we feel, people will find us when they need us, than going out and telling people this is who we are, so it's a funny, seeking and serving Christ in all persons. I see this as kind of the outreach work that we do, working with the homeless, working with the hungry. We're serving Christ in all persons, all of these hungry folks, or these folks who are need clothing. That, when was I in prison and you came and visited me? When was I sick and you came and visited me? That's that seeking and serving Christ in all persons. And then the bottom one is to strive for justice and peace among all people. This I see as sort of the advocacy. Let's change the structures that are making these people poor or homeless. Are there structural changes that we can address? So that dignity of every person, the justice and peace and dignity issues, that's part of our mission, is to engage in those kinds of things. Several years ago, there was a proposal to add yet another clause to the baptismal covenant. It's got stalled at General Convention, and that's the one that's there in red. That will you cherish the wondrous works of God and protect the beauty and integrity of all creation? I will, with God's help, would be how that would be answered. That has not officially been added into the baptismal covenant. We use it. It might be technically illegal. I mean, we could be told not to use it by the church. I don't think anybody's going to complain. It's proposed, and so I think we can use it. But again, these are our mission as Christians. And how we sort of talk about them in the Episcopal Church. And it's spelled out, like I say, in a lot of different ways. One of the things that we do really well, and the book talked about it, although the title has changed, that for a long time, we have this relief arm of the church. It was called the Presiding Bishop's Fund for World Relief. And it was our disaster relief fund. Now it's called Episcopal Relief and Development. And so We've got, we'll send money and people down to help with the hurricanes in Florida. We had money and people working on the Marshall Fire. We've got money and people going to, the victims of forest fires. I'm sure we've got money and people going to California to help deal with all of those floods. We've got money and people that have gone, to the tsunami that was in Thailand. So it's global. This is our global relief fund, and that's mission 2. And we fund all of this through, ultimately through the congregations and our pledge and the money that goes to the congregation. A portion of our budget goes to the diocese, and a portion of the diocesan budget goes to the national church. And all of those have monies that go out into all of these various mission fields as well. Our region bands together to provide mission opportunities that none of the congregations could do by themselves. But if you put 4 or 5 congregations together, or 8 or 10, you can come up with $15,000 that can do some work that one congregation would never be able to afford. So it's a multifaceted approach to mission. If we knew all of this stuff, if you all knew all of the stuff that the Episcopal Church does, you'd sort of be blown away by the missions that we are engaged in. So that's kind of where we are. And so what's next? And then we'll just do, what's next. Bishop Kim will be a good shepherd in a week and a half, and we'll have some confirmations and reception into the Episcopal Church, and that'll be fun. So, questions, comments on anything that we've talked about tonight, or anything that you would like to pick up from before, or anything that we haven't touched on that you wished we would have?
So if we're interested in confirmation, is there a covenant that we commit to? Is it in writing? Is something that can be reviewed before we make that decision?
You could. I'm stumbling only because there isn't really anything that you sign. You go before the bishop. You would reaffirm your baptismal covenant, because that's one of the things that we always do, and then a sponsor, which in our case would be me, would present you to the bishop. The bishop, I'll just tell you what happens. This is for anybody who is going to be confirmed or received. Bishops say, do you reaffirm your renunciation of evil? Do you renew your commitment to Jesus Christ? Yes, I do, and I will follow him as Savior and Lord. Everybody else says, yeah, we'll help them. Then you renew the baptismal covenant. There is a prayer over you that the bishop will say, and then the bishop for confirmation will lay hands and say, strengthen, O Lord, your servant with the Holy Spirit. Empower him or her for your service, and sustain him or her all the days of their life. So there's nothing that's signed. No, it's a commitment before the bishop to live out your baptismal vows in the communion of the church. But if you want, if you're looking for a statement of belief or faith or something like that, that would be, kind of the outline of the faith that's in the back of the prayer book. That sort of is what we've talked about over these last several weeks, but it's all there in about 20 pages in question and answer format.
I was confirmed in the Catholic Church when I was very young, and I used to have a certificate that said,
well, if you were confirmed in the Catholic Church, technically you would be received into the Episcopal Church, because you would have already been confirmed by a bishop in apostolic succession. If you were confirmed as a Catholic, you would be received into the Episcopal Church. Ceremony is for all intents and purposes exactly the same. It's just that the words over you by the bishop are a little bit different.
Okay, like I said, I had a certificate at one time, but I don't know where that would be now. It's been it's been over 60 years since I was confirmed. And I don't think I have that certificate anymore. Would that be an issue?
We can find out. We can find out. Do you remember where?
So it was a Holy Ghost Church in Denver here.
Oh, downtown?
Yeah,
Oh, the big one downtown that's got wonderful marble all over it?
yes, that's the one.
They would have the record. I would imagine that they would have the record of that. If you called them, they could probably tell you when, and that's all we would need.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah. Good question. What do you do when you can't find all these things? I've got the certificate. I will say I have my certificate of baptism somewhere. I just know that it was December 31st and I was 12 or 13, so I could go back and figure out the year, but it was on New Year's Eve day. Now that's odd, but anyway, so other questions?
So do you just call us down to the front of the church for the
I'll send you some more information. But
Okay.
basically what will happen is that on that Sunday morning, you'll have an opportunity to meet with the bishop ahead of time. I'm going to be talking with her tomorrow to just finalize logistics. But since the service is at 9:30, my suspicion is that she will be happy to meet with the four of you at 8:45 and talk to you, get to know you, talk a little bit about, ask questions, answer questions, just be a human being with you. That so she, this is one of the things that people like prior to the confirmations. But then the service begins like a baptismal service. It's just that we're not going to have baptisms this time. And so after the sermon, the language, and I'll just read you what it says here. Excuse me, should have left that open. So the gospel and then the sermon, and the bishop says, the candidates will now be presented. And so at that point, after the sermon, you would just come down to the front. And I would step down there with you, and the bishop would say the candidates will now be presented, and I would just say I present these persons for confirmation, because there's some for whom that's the case, and these persons for reception. And then the bishop kind of takes it from there. And if you're going to be confirmed, the bishop will lay hands on you and anoint you with oil. If you are going to be received, the bishop will lay hands, but not anoint, because you would have been anointed when you were confirmed in another tradition. Okay, so, and then there will be the prayer, and then there's the peace, and everybody goes back, and stuff continues on as a normal service. Good question. But once I talk with the bishop tomorrow, I'll send something out that has all of the times and all of that kind of stuff. And so, anything else? I realized I realized the other day that I didn't send you that comparison of the creeds. They're sitting on my desk. My day went kablooey this morning, but I will send them out. Don't worry. I've got stuff for you. So, what were you saying, Sandy?
No, we just thank you for your service. I mean, not your service, but we thank you for your time doing this, because
Sure.
we know
No,
how
it's
busy
great.
you are.
Yeah, well, it's great to do. I get reminded of stuff all the time. It makes me think about things a little differently. The classic is you never learn something so well as you do when you're teaching it.
That's very true.
And so this is always good for me for that very reason. So so thank you for being a part of this, and it's been fun. And if you've got any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and we'll go forward. All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you
Good.
Thank you, Father
again.
Stay
Gary.
safe, stay dry. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Okay,
Good night.
thank you.